I say this and everybody gets upset with me. The stablecoin that will probably dominate the future has not been created yet, right, is my prediction. And why I think that is if blockchains really only were created in, call it 2009, 2010, depending on how you want to measure it, in internet terms, we're in the early 90s.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Crypto Playbook. Today, we're here to talk stablecoins. I'm Jeff John Roberts.
And I'm Leo Schwartz.
We've been in the news. Leo, what's up with stablecoins?
Yeah, I joke that I'm no longer a fintech or crypto reporter. I'm a stablecoin reporter. It seems like the buzzword to kill all buzzwords. I think we've talked about before, but stablecoins are not a new concept in crypto. They've been around for almost as long as crypto. It's this idea that you can basically take an existing asset, whether it's the US dollar or gold or oil, and basically create a tokenized form of it. Of course, dollars have proven to be the most popular one. You have, of course, Tether, which is a nearly $170 billion market cap now. There's a whole host of new stable coins to challenge Tether over the past few years, from USDC to PayPal stablecoin. Now we're seeing more ones launched every year. And of course, with Congress passing the Genius Act, which was legislation in July to establish guardrails around stablecoins, it seems that everyone and their mother wants either their own stablecoin or wants to integrate stablecoins onto their platform. As we always say here, the question is, what are stablecoins going to be proved useful for? Who's going to use them? What are they going to actually do? And I think we can really tackle that with today's episode.
Yeah, I know, Leo, you're definitely the right guy to be taking this on, because if you don't do this job, I could see you taking a job as like Congress stablecoin expert or something, because Leo, you've probably written about 200 stories on these on stablecoins. Before we get into what's going on now, though, I think it's useful, though, for historical context. Like, they've been around for over 10 years, and let's just go way back. What's the point of having a dollar? Basically, they're a dollar. That's what they are. Why do we have them in the first place? What was the purpose of them?
I'd say there's three main use cases that have always been there for stablecoins. The first and most obvious one is that if you live outside the US, but you really want access to a stable form of currency, the US dollar, stablecoins like Tether have offered a way to be able to essentially hold the US dollar without actually needing a bank account to do it. That's really one of the ways that Tether was able to gain such a massive market cap. Another is to be able to do payments, so peer-to-peer payments, again, using blockchain rails, doing it outside of the normal banking system. Again, this is a way that Tether has proven really popular through this type of peer-to-peer payment transfer. And then the third, which is where options like USDC or Circle stablecoin have proven really popular, is for crypto trading. So if you're operating on exchanges and you're trading between different crypto assets, you don't necessarily want to have all of your holdings in Bitcoin or ETH all the time, which are really volatile. So often you'll basically settle your trades back into stable coins like USDC, which are, as the name states, more stable. Of course, now with Genius, I think there's an argument that the use cases can proliferate, including more mainstream use cases like doing checkout on Amazon using stablecoins. And that's really where crypto advocates argue the future of all payments are going to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. And on your third point, too, of being able to keep your funds in crypto, because, historically, whenever you kind of go back and forth between fiat traditional currency and crypto, you get a bunch of scrutiny, tax obligations and stuff like that. So you've just made a killing selling, Dogecoin or, fart coin or whatever you've done that day, rather than cashing it out into your bank account, which will trigger big capital gains and stuff like that. You can just sort of park it in stable coins for a bit before you kind of have to engage all of that too. And you give three use cases, and I'll give a fourth, crime.
Yes, I think there's a lot of evidence that global illicit finance, from money laundering to terrorist financing, has been used with stablecoins. This has been a huge argument against Tether for many years, which has seen court actions, enforcement actions by the New York Attorney General. There was a reported investigation by the Department of Justice for years. But now Tether has really allied itself with the Trump administration and just announced that they're launching a U.S. compliant version of their popular Tether stablecoin.
Yeah, and I mean, to be, fair to Tether, they seem to have cleaned up their act a lot. And I don't think the fact a lot of criminals use Tether historically isn't necessarily their fault. Could they have done more to stop that? Yeah, probably. But, I do think that's a fast evolving thing too. And, the other thing that intrigues me too about stablecoins too are these sort of corridors of stablecoins opening up outside of, like if, Iran and China and Russia want to pay each other back and forth, these new corridors opening up that are getting increasingly hard to control. And I think in the sort of the meta level, it's interesting to see, will Uncle Sam be able to kind of keep a tight control over the dollar? But that's perhaps, one for geopolitical experts, not necessarily this episode.
Someone I've been talking to about stablecoins for years, Austin Campbell, I think he has one of the best views on the technology and how it's evolved. He used to be a banker at Citi and JP Morgan before working as the chief risk officer at Paxos, which is one of the premier stablecoin companies. Now he's a business school professor and consults for a number of crypto projects. So I think he'll be able to really answer key questions. Where are stablecoins heading? Will they be able to break out of this more insulated crypto use case into the mainstream, which I think for stablecoins to actually become something that are part of everyday economics and society, they basically have to be used by real financial institutions and not just by crypto traders.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this interview too, because Austin also strikes me as kind of the rare grown-up on crypto Twitter who often, has got very sort of astute takes. And I'm curious too about how much this is hype, because you're hearing, I know you and Ben have broke stories about, Google, Amazon, every company and their dog, it seems, is going to be incorporating stable coins to lower, internal transfer payments for, goodness knows what else. But it's an exploding category, and I think we've got the right guy to break it down. So looking forward to that interview very much.
Well, Austin, thank you so much for joining us here today. I think you're the perfect guest to have about stablecoins, because I think we've been speaking about stablecoins for the past few years relentlessly, and now it's the topic of the day. So I don't think there's anybody better to help explain why you should care about stablecoins.
Yeah, and I think relentless is a good word. So happy to be here to discuss.
So you have an interesting background. You were in the giant banks before, Citi and JP Morgan. You went and worked at one of the top stablecoin companies, Paxos, as an executive. You're a business school professor now and still do some consulting. So can you just give a bit of an overview about what your journey into crypto has looked like?
Yeah, I would say compared to most people who get into crypto, who usually get into it because of an interest in Bitcoin or an interest in the technology, I may have had crypto inflicted upon me. And what I mean by that is when I was at JP Morgan, I ran a couple of trading businesses, but one of them was the cash stability products. And stop me if you've heard this story before, but there's a thing in US 401ks called stable value funds where the participants, regardless of the underlying instruments, need to be able to trade in and out of that at a fixed stable value over time. This is basically a stable coin, even though it's not on a blockchain. So as these started emerging into the financial system, I was at JP Morgan and started getting asked about them like tangentially in some of JPM's projects at the time. And then I was at an asset manager / hedge fund called Stone Ridge, where we had a crypto custodian called NYDIG, so really started getting into the space then. And then at Citi, when these were going mainstream, until the point that I was dragged into Paxos. And all of it was from the framework of crypto people have done a good job thinking about tech in general. They've done a pretty poor job thinking about financial architecture underlying these things. And I kept just asking questions that either confused or scared people in the crypto space as I continued to ask them. And as a result, eventually I got put in charge of a stablecoin. So I guess score one for just relentless curiosity.
And I think it's one of my favorite recurring bits that you have on the infamous crypto Twitter, where you're constantly imploring people to remember to be some semblance of adults, especially when it comes to the finance.
Yeah, I've had a couple of people jokingly refer to me as the adult supervision for the industry, and I'm not totally sure that that's a great sign always.
And what's interesting about stablecoins is, I mean, you can pretty easily track the history of crypto by the stunning collapses that have happened over the years, and often humorous, often not humorous. Stablecoins have been at the center of a few of them. Of course, you have the Terra Luna one with Do Kwon and algorithmic stablecoins. You have the Circle collapse with USDC and Silicon Valley Bank. Tether has always been looming in the background, and I think people have assumed that at some point it might depeg, which it hasn't, and has come roaring into the US recently. But it seems important to have someone in your role who actually says, okay, this is how we have to do this in a responsible way. And it sort of seems like we're actually getting to that point. Do you think that's true?
Certainly in the United States. One of the things that crypto has done is just sort of applied the term stablecoin to anything that aspirationally wanted to be a representation of the dollar on a blockchain. And just like in traditional finance, there are many ways to do this, and some of them are very likely to be stable, and some of them are very likely not to be stable, right? Like this is sort of a lesson the traditional financial markets learned the hard way in 2008. And crypto, in its own typical fashion, is kind of speed running some of the lessons of finance by stepping on all the landmines to learn things in their own way. In the United States, we just passed Genius this year, and the definition of a stablecoin in Genius is not the definition the crypto industry has been using, which is kind of anything that might sort of hold a dollar peg. Genius basically says, listen, guys, we saw everything break in 2008, and we did a bunch of reform. And in traditional markets, the answer is basically government money market funds are the best way to hold a dollar peg and not have things explode everywhere. In the United States in 2018, back to your point on crypto rising, the New York Department of Financial Services was confronted with stablecoins and basically stole the homework of the U.S. banking regulators from money market reform and said, stablecoins should be government money market funds. And I'll remind everybody, despite all of the adventures of stablecoins globally, NYDFS stablecoins have never really depegged or had peg stability or redemption problems. They've been working fine since 2018. And this is not a backwater. They used to have, before BUSD was shut down, the third largest stablecoin in the world in that regime. And so the Genius Bill looked at all of this and said, well, why don't we just steal the NYDFS's homework? So now we're in a world where there's a legally mandated definition in the United States of what a stablecoin is, and that thing is the thing that works in traditional finance. So this is probably the first major step of the stablecoin space growing up that happened this year in the U.S.
Question is, right now, stablecoins, for all the hype around them, are still vastly used only in crypto, basically for crypto trading, as settlement for crypto trading. Do you think that people outside of crypto should actually start paying attention to them?
So one, I'm not sure that's as true as people think anymore. And I think a lot of that relates to data problems in the space and misinterpretations. Like if you look at the Visa study, and my friend Nick Carter was involved in that, they will tell you that we can attribute a lot of small dollar value payments in one direction to people because you can see that data on chain. But that exactly as you said, of the stuff that's moving transparently on chain, a decent amount is still crypto trading. Maybe, it's not 90% anymore, but still a lot. The thing that's harder to track for people because kind of the invisibility is the point is folks who buy US dollar stablecoins once and then do nothing with them. And there's a lot of those. Like as a guy who used to run Binance's stablecoin, there is more of that activity than you think. And often you don't see it because if they bought it on a regulated exchange, here's the transaction. I had Bitcoin because I got from my local currency to Bitcoin. I swapped the Bitcoin for a US dollar stablecoin, so that looks like crypto trading. But what it really was FX. That's my local currency into dollars, just using Bitcoin as the conduit. And then nothing happens, right? Because if I live in like Turkey or Nigeria or Argentina, what I might really want is just to get my assets both into dollars and out of my local system where I might not trust the rule of law. There's a decent amount of that. And I would tell people, if you're thinking of the stablecoin story purely as crypto trading, you're probably living in the United States or living in Europe and ideally situated to miss the value proposition of these things because you live in the part of the world where your banking system largely works and you're happy to use it. But transplant sort of your mentality to a place that has persistent corruption and persistent instability and persistent inflation and ask yourself, how would I think of a US dollar stablecoin? So if you want to look at the driver of those really large predictions, or like, Besant's Treasury was talking about this, It's the idea that a lot of people in local currencies that have had huge inflation or unstable banking systems are now able to voluntarily opt into the dollar system instead.
And I think that's an important point and raises an interesting question, which, I mean, you look at the largest stablecoin, which is Tether, by a huge degree. It has a nearly $170 billion market cap the last time I checked. And I think there's certainly an argument to be made that one of the reasons it's gained in popularity so much is for the use case that you mentioned, that people outside the US want to have access to the dollar. But I think if you talk about stablecoins' potential for growth, and when you hear all these companies getting into the space, from Citi to Stripe talking about it, they're looking at it for not necessarily this store of value, but as a form of payments, as international settlement. And this is really the use case that would have to break out of the bounds of crypto and really be embraced by non-crypto folks. And what I think I'm asking about, which is, when I talk to especially fintech and banking people outside of crypto, I always ask about this. Will stablecoins be used for global treasury, for cross-border payments by businesses, even for peer-to-peer payments outside of the US? And they keep saying, we're still very early. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. We're not seeing a huge amount of demand for that, which is obviously different than what you hear from crypto folks. So I guess going back to that question, do you think non-crypto people should start caring about this outside of that use case of store of value? Do you think those applications will be used anytime soon?
So I'm probably more bullish on them being used sometime soon, and I also understand why the regulated financial people have missed the boat on this, which is a lot of them are US-based in a space where, for the past 4 years under the Biden administration, our banking regulators in particular were hysterically negative on crypto, and so blocking everybody. So even if you wanted to use it, you couldn't. And so, of course, they're not seeing any demand. When the administration is telling you all people using crypto are money laundering and criminals and we're going to investigate you, you don't, as a corporation, stick your hand up and say, hey, I'm going to use crypto, right? Like, that's not how it works. But I would tell you, if you look at Asia, more people are already using these than people really understand. Again, because you might not see all the activity if it's going from exchange wallet to exchange wallet. So I'm somewhat more optimistic there. I think the parts, if you're looking at why this has had a hard time taking off, are sort of twofold. One, we haven't had a really good regulated US dollar stablecoin yet. Genius paves the way for that. And if I'm a large corporate treasury and I've got risk and controls and disclosure obligations, Tether is a really hard ask for me. Like, it is very well designed for retail users. It's more liquid than people think. But if I'm a large business, I want to be like, what's in your reserves? How do I redeem? And they're like, well, redemptions are technically at our discretion and we're not going to tell you about the reserves. And so your risk committee is just like, no. Right. And so you need a better option there. Two, God, crypto has been terrible at like UI UX for normal two-legged human beings. There's sort of this meme in the space of everybody should become an expert, right? Like, you need to learn the tech, you need to learn how to use all these things. And like, I constantly tell the crypto people, guys, that's a refutation of the idea of specialization of labor. Like, that's crazy. And like, the example I use here is my father. So my dad is super smart. He's got a PhD in neurobiology, an MD, like, treated people with cancer for years. But it would be insane to go to him and be like, hey, look, I know you're spending 80 hours a week saving people who have cancer, but like, screw them. You need to learn how technology works so you can move your money around efficiently and using self-custody. Like, not going to happen. And that's not an efficient allocation of resources for humanity. So I think crypto kind of needs to have its wake-up moment on UI UX. I think it is getting there, though. As you see companies like Stripe and PayPal getting in, they know what they're doing on the UI UX front, so they may drag the rest of crypto along kicking and screaming.
So who do you think it's going to be? When is that breakthrough going to happen? What are you most bullish on right now between Stripe and PayPal? And also, a bit of a disclaimer that I know that you do some consulting on the side, so might have worked with some of these companies.
Yeah, and that kind of informs my view, which is, I say this and everybody gets upset with me. The stablecoin that will probably dominate the future has not been created yet, right, is my prediction. And why I think that is, if blockchains really only were created in, call it 2009, 2010, depending on how you want to measure it, in internet terms, we're in the early 90s. And I want you to go back and look at things like AOL, Yahoo, Netscape, and like, how many of those have actually stood the test of time? Almost none. I would suggest the innovation cycle is still in the messing around and seeing what works phase. I have not yet seen like what becomes the Facebook or Amazon come out of the crypto space. And as a result of that, as I'm watching all of these trends, I'm saying a good stablecoin needs to be liquid, highly distributed, with reserves that people understand and think are safe, and then pretty fungible for usage globally. And various people have hit like parts of that. Nobody has hit all of it, right? And ironically, probably best positioned from a fundamentals standpoint to hit all of it are some of the big banks, but most of them are 3 years behind being 3 years behind in this space. So we're still very early.
And then, I mean, obviously, as someone who is bullish on this space, so taking that as a caveat, what do you think is the upper bounds for what can happen with stablecoins in the next 10 years? I mean, is this going to be the next Visa MasterCard where basically, you know, the vast majority of payments between merchants is happening on this? Is this going to eat away the way that our both national and international payment systems work?
So that I do think over 10 years, because the current system just economically is terrible for the users of the system, both from a payment standpoint. Like if you've ever tried to send an international wire, you probably understand what I'm talking about. Like it's an awful experience. If it goes well, it usually costs you some amount of money that is more than you wanted to pay and takes like a business day or two. And that's if things go great. If it doesn't, it takes you like percentage points of your transaction and takes 5+ business days. Like, guys, right? Like this is a 1970s system that is kind of shambling forward and still around. And so it really needs to be replaced. And then the second part is the peer-to-peer value proposition is completely broken, right? Like if I have a stable coin and I'm like a retailer in Finland who needs to pay a vendor in Thailand, and I can do it in a couple of seconds at like half a cent on a blockchain, at some point, that economic incentive is just large enough that it starts to eat away and win. I do think one thing we need to be careful of, though, is the natural instinct of people is to say what corporation will win, like, or what like legal entity will win when we think about this. But the lesson of the internet has been actually what happens is consumers writ large win and intermediaries just get destroyed. Right? Like there are many industries that just were strictly downsized and the economic rents that they were capturing were distributed to consumers. I think there's a real chance that happens here.
Although you could have a Stripe, right, which is obviously moving into the space, the infrastructure layers, or even a Visa or a MasterCard that are facilitating all these payments. So I also think another interesting question is, you know, the cross-border use case obviously makes a lot of sense because it's so expensive and unwieldy. But what about within a country? Like, do you think it will get to the point, and a lot of, you know, a company like Circle has always done some pilots or products around this, but will it ever make sense for a normal consumer to pay for their cup of coffee and the payment is processed on the back end using stablecoins?
I do think that's going to start happening, but the consumer won't be thinking about it or know about it. And that's how you'll know it's actually real, right? Like if, again, to go back to the specialization of labor comment, if I have to think deeply about, oh God, how do I pay for this sandwich? That system is not going to take off. But if I can just, for lack of a better way to describe it, tap my phone and it works, that's going to happen. And so as you think about infrastructure layer, it will be whoever is good at abstracting away those differences for the consumer, because in a lot of, especially in first world countries, the consumers are not the ones with the problem. Right? Like you can go tap with a debit card or a credit card or like some mobile pay solution and it just works from the perspective of the consumer. There's not a big upgrade there. There is for the merchants, right? Like if you understand how interchange works, you quickly understand why a lot of low margin businesses start giving you better prices if you pay in cash than if you pay with cards. They are the ones who are going to have a big incentive to get consumers using these alternate payment solutions. But to do that, they need to be easy to use. And so it is sort of back to the UI UX comment, but I think it will probably be a pull function through merchants rather than pushing through the consumers to get that done in most of these places.
Which is why it seems so significant that you have a Stripe, for example, embracing it. Because, I mean, it does seem like a chicken and egg problem to some degree where you have to convince people to come on board. But if you have a major company like Stripe putting so many resources into it, obviously that could create demand in a way.
And I'm more optimistic about some of, call it, the Visa MasterCard competitors, because they have the incentive to erode their current business model because the prize is eating Visa or MasterCard, right? Like this is the classic innovator's dilemma. The people with the biggest monopolies right now don't want to disrupt themselves, but the outsiders totally want to disrupt them. So if you look at innovation cycles, like it's hard to pick a specific winner right now, but if I were looking across the space, I would be saying financial transformation takes longer than people think, but if I'm betting on horses, it's probably the outsiders laying siege to the current thing, which does one of two things. Either killing a lot of the incumbents or forcing at least one of the incumbents to transform to adopt the business model themselves. Like it's entirely possible the winner is Visa, but what it is just like Visa at the current scale, but with lower margins.
It's similar to, what Google is facing right now with AI.
Exactly right. Or, quite frankly, if you look at, examples of this in other industries that just dealt with regular way internet commerce, they had to go from like, oh, I have this large store that captures a lot of rents because I'm the only one selling this in a local area, to having to compete with Amazon. And like Target and Walmart still exist, but they've had to radically transform their business models from, say, 50 years ago.
So let's take the bearish case, because what's so fun about covering crypto is the industry always has a way of cutting its nose to spite its face. I think I got that saying slightly wrong, but what do you think could go wrong with stablecoins that would deflate this hype cycle and bubble that we're currently in?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. One is that crypto people keep pushing financial innovations that are not innovation. They're just leverage wrapped in like a cheap package, right? This is a thing that financial markets try to do writ large. If you take stablecoins that are distributed to consumers that seem like they're trustworthy and then they just completely nuke and everybody loses all their money, you will set the space back a long time. And if you don't believe me, go ask people right now in 2025 if they trust their bank, reminding you that 2008 was when the financial crisis was. Two, I do think it's very possible if crypto doesn't take security and anti-financial crime properly, you're going to have a large enough scandal in that space that while it won't stop the march of progress, you could really slow it down with a lot of nation states clamping down on this activity, right? If you have somebody clueless who turns out to have been channeling like hundreds of billions of dollars for, say, the Mexican drug cartels, and just clueless about it or actively enabling them, that will be a giant problem. And crypto has this issue of a lot of very ideologically libertarian people who refuse to acknowledge the existence of crime.
Well, that leads to my next question, which is Tether, which I think is one of the most interesting companies in this space. I mean, this is a company that I think a lot of people outside of crypto haven't heard of, but it's one of the most profitable companies in the world, certainly by its employee count, makes billions in profit every year. And until last year, it was mostly shunned from the U.S. because of its history, both not really being clear with its reserves, as well as what you just talked about, this iffy way that it was involved, or its stablecoin was used in illicit finance. Recently, you've seen a huge sea change where Tether has been embraced by the Trump administration. I mean, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, was previously the head of Cantor Fitzgerald, who's the custodian of the reserves. And I'm curious, from your perspective, having watched this story for so long, do you buy Tether's rebrand, that they are now this compliant company that can really come into the U.S. and not maybe cause some of the problems that people thought it would in the past?
So I've always been a Tether moderate, which makes everybody on both sides angry, which is to say the claims that it's like a Ponzi scheme or doesn't have the reserves, those are false. Like, otherwise, you're basically saying Cantor Fitzgerald committed massive securities fraud by claiming that they had the reserves when they don't. And they do, right? Like, Tether has the money at this point. On the other hand, do I think Tether is completely clean? No. I've worked in financial services. Anything of that scale is not going to be clean. And a little bit like the Binance story, it almost certainly was much worse early on, because when you're a janky startup trying to figure this stuff out without a lot of expertise internally, you're going to be the weak hand and some bad people will use you. I think the real story of Tether is that it's improved significantly over time compared to where they started, but is also probably not yet a first-class effort from an anti-financial crime standpoint, but that is true of most banks too. And so my take on Tether is I think the AML anti-financial crime part is probably solvable. There's been more cooperation with law enforcement than people realize with Tether. They've actually frozen billions of dollars of funds in the past. And I think that could accelerate and improve even more from here if they really want to come to the United States. Like that will be part and parcel of the negotiations. I'm actually in some ways more concerned about their reserves, which is to say, if you want to claim you're a dollar like stablecoin and you hold reserves that even though they've performed very well, like say gold and Bitcoin, at some point there are downturns in assets as well. Like I've lived through a lot of financial crises. And so you need to understand with that volatility in there, they had better have significant excess capital, or at some point there will be reserve concerns for Tether. And that's not a statement that individually any of these are bad choices. That's just a statement that like price volatility exists.
Yeah, it does seem like the potential looming black swan event in the future for both stablecoins and certainly crypto more broadly. And I mean, from a reporting perspective, I think an interesting thread is now that law enforcement is certainly turning away from enforcement actions, does that create some sort of moral hazard or incentive for companies to not necessarily act in the most rigorous way?
So I'll say I'm actually not certain I agree with you on that. I think they're turning away from regulatory enforcement actions like SEC, CFTC, things of that sort. I'm not so sure the DOJ is going to give people a pass because there's a very different argument between, oh, you had an unregistered security or, oh, that was a futures contract you shouldn't have traded versus, oh, you paid $2 billion to North Korea, right? I would tell you, I would gently warn people if you think they're going to go soft on like the OFAC stuff and the like severe money laundering, you might want to look at how the Trump administration continued the Tornado Cash prosecution instead of pulling that off the table.
Mm-hmm. Although I think we just saw reporting that they might be lifting the compliance monitor off Binance or exploring that.
I would suggest, again, that may be a misunderstanding. They're looking at moving it from the DOJ to FinCEN, not getting rid of it. That's basically saying, hey, we think we've remediated the extremely severe stuff, and now you belong with the people who police anti-financial crime writ large.
All right, here's the last question, the hard-hitting one. What's your favorite stablecoin?
Oh, God. Okay, so the question for that actually becomes, what are you trying to do with it? So safety and soundness, I would tell you for now, because nobody really is ingenious yet, use one of the NYDFS stablecoins, right? So the stuff coming out of Paxos or GMO, anything like that is going to work well because the reserve framework there is well understood and comes from traditional finance. Like you're basically buying Vanguard's government money market fund, and that is boring and safe. If you want something that's liquid globally, it's Tether. That's your best like choice for moving money around. And if you want something that's actually going to generate yield, there are, call it very traditional financial strategies that have been ported over to crypto that look like basis trades. So for instance, like Athena is the one that's most well known. There's companies like Xe where I'm an advisor doing more customized versions of this. And if you're trying to like generate some degree of yield without price volatility, they're the most interesting. So in the space writ large, depending on how you would define stablecoin, because some of those are not payment stablecoins under Genius, that's the interesting space.
Well, you heard it from the expert. Thanks so much, Austin, for joining us. This was great.
Thank you very much.
Well, Leo, that Austin Campbell, smart fellow, huh?
Yeah, I think he's always been one of the best people in crypto at explaining crypto in a sane and logical way. And I think he's often taken the role of trying to do that to other crypto people, which is fun.
Yeah, and even on crypto Twitter, which is a thankless task, let me tell you. There's a lot in that interview. What struck you the most, or what sort of learnings did you come away from that?
I mean, we talked a lot about what has to happen for crypto to break out of the crypto sphere. And I think his points about really changing the UI and the UX, or basically how people interact with stablecoins, is important, and what can happen with it outside of just using it as a store of value for people not in the US who want access to dollars or crypto trading. And, I think his background in finance really colors his experience for what crypto can really be. I think the question, as always, is whether it can get there and whether regulation and appetite outside of crypto will actually catch up.
Yeah, and I found it refreshing to hear that. I'm actually hearing that more and more quarters on the UX element too, because I think we've always known the UX in crypto has been horrible, but now, and the line was always, we're building the back end, it will come, but now it seems people are paying attention and realizing for this to kind of get escape velocity, the front end has got to be as good as, Facebook or Gmail or even my online banking, and it feels like we're making some progress there.
Yeah, and he did use one of the cliches in crypto that I usually cringe at, which is, we're in the early innings. It's like the 90s of the internet. But I think in this case, it's fair because stablecoins just got regulation with the Genius Act passed by Congress. There's been a lot of companies operating in the space. But, the other thing he said that really struck me was the real winner might not even be around yet. It actually is the early innings just because for the first time, companies can really build in a regulated, supervised way.
Yeah, fair enough. Although early innings, yes. At least it's not first inning. That's what I've started to do when people say that to me. I'm ask which early inning, because come on, we're like 15 years in. We can't be in the first anymore. But I take the point. Well, that's a wrap. This has been the Fortune Crypto Playbook. I'm Jeff John Roberts.
And I'm Leo Schwartz. See you next time. This was the Crypto Playbook, a Fortune magazine podcast. Our producer and editor is Ellen Estev. Our production manager is Sam Freund. Our executive producer is Lydia Randall. Fortune's head of video is Adam Bannicky.